Who was that? Rena inquired of me. Seated in the quaint bistro, I endeavored to process the collision of two distinct realms that had unfolded in the past few moments. Glancing up, I met Rena's captivating gaze. Her exquisite, exotic features, with long, dark hair cascading over golden-tan skin, framed by high cheekbones, wore an expression of puzzlement. I paused, maintaining eye contact, and took a deep breath. That, I started, exhaling slowly, was Jasmine. I disclosed to her. Rena tilted her head, her brows furrowed in confusion as she continued to gaze at me, seeking understanding. Then, suddenly, comprehension dawned upon her, and the light of recognition flickered in her eyes. "That was your Jasmine?" she asked, incredulous. Her mind was trying to associate what she had previously heard with what she had just seen. "Rena, sweetheart," I began gently, "she and I were together a long time ago. I haven't seen her in 5 or 6 years, or maybe even more," I explained to her. "I just didn't know that she was so," Rena began, her words trailing off. "I know," I interjected gently. "I probably need to tell you the whole story," I admitted. Rena sat across from me, her gaze fixed on mine. With a single nod, she silently conveyed her willingness to listen to the tale. 9 years ago, other than a 1-week Goodwill chaperone church trip to Mexico, I had never been farther away than a few hours from my rural home before I enrolled as a freshman at Taft University. The small universe of people I had known were restricted to the other agricultural families near our tiny town of Benton. The fact that my parents were deeply religious and raised the family that way further perpetuated my naivete. My parents were cautiously happy that I had received an agricultural scholarship at Taft, but I also think they were worried about my being away from home, in a college environment. And now, suddenly, I was in a dorm room at college along with hundreds of other young people my age. My roommate, Charlie, was from Chicago. At first I suspected he was a little disappointed that he got stuck with the hick from the country as a roommate, but as time passed we became friends. The stories my fellow dorm mates told shocked me. I'd had a girlfriend in high school, but all we had ever done was hold hands and kiss. Now I was hearing the most outrageous descriptions of sexual debauchery. I think the guys on my dorm floor enjoyed trying to shock me with their experiences. I wondered about all the things they told me. Could all these stories be true? Do people actually do all of this to each other? Another surprising situation was that the boys' dorms and the girls' dorms were mixed within the same building. Different floors but the same buildings. The boys had the odd floors and the girls had the even floors. One day I had planned to borrow a book from a girl in my freshman English class. Her dorm was in my building a few floors up from my floor. As I opened the door to her dorm floor, I saw 2 girls leaving the shower room clad only in fairly small towels. I couldn't help it. I turned and stared. They noticed. One girl turned to the other girl and whispered something, and then they both giggled. "Hey Owen," the girls called to me. I turned back to look at them, and they both opened their towels to expose their nude bodies. I was completely shocked, as well as sexually excited. You have to understand, beside once years ago seeing my mother, not sexually exciting whatsoever, accidentally in the bathroom and one of my friends showing me an old low-end men's magazine behind the barn just once, I had exactly zero exposure to the female body. I ogled at them. Way too soon the girls covered up and made their way down the hall laughing at my reaction. In my sexually excited embarrassment, I completely forgot about the English book, but the vision of the 2 co-eds played an endless tantalizing mental loop through my brain for a long time afterward. So to say I was naive and inexperienced would be a huge understatement. Gradually, my fellow dorm mates realized how inexperienced I was and I became the subject of great teasing. Despite my innocence, I was still a normal, healthy, sexually charged 19-year-old boy with the same urges. Battling these urges was the deep-seated religious environment I was raised within. Sex was shameful. Do not objectify females. Sexual activity was saved for marriage, and the purpose of intercourse was strictly for procreation. This was the type of message that I had been raised around. All these new sexual revelations were completely opposite of the moral teachings I grew up with. The temptations of female companionship struggled with my religious psyche. So by the time I was a junior at Taft University, I was still a virgin. That is not to say I hadn't achieved some form of sexual experience. Midway through my junior year, my sexual history consisted of 1 BJ, 3 handjobs, and then I met Jasmine. On the weekends at Taft, there were always parties to be found. In fact, if you looked hard enough, there was likely a party any night of the week. Charlie and my other freshman dorm friends were always up for a good party and constantly asked me to join them. I was intent upon my studies, my parents' work ethic ever present in my brain, and so I didn't hit the party scene all that often, maybe an average of 1 or 2 times maximum per month. Speaking of my studies, I was focused on the science of agriculture. I really didn't plan on farming for a living like my family does, but I was interested in ways to make farming in our community and elsewhere better. There were different opportunities at Taft to study abroad and learn about different concepts from foreign countries. I was extremely interested in the idea of studying somewhere overseas. Perhaps this desire was fueled by my sheltered upbringing and the need to explore as much of the rest of the world as possible. I was hoping to travel somewhere my senior year. It was early spring of my junior year, and Charlie convinced me to attend a keg party with him and a group of guys that I originally met in the freshman dorms. The setting was a big open field near the football stadium. There were red and white, the Taft colors, tents set up in the field, and you paid $10 to get in and drink cheap beer. I had been to enough of these things that some of the behaviors didn't shock me like they had when I first arrived. True, I was still a virgin, and I was still kind of torn about my sexual state. I knew at some point I was going to have full-blown sex. I just guessed my moral upbringing was pretty hardwired, and I didn't pursue the grand prize of intercourse with the same zeal as my friends. At the party, I was hanging out with a clump of my friends, just watching the interesting social interactions unfold. At one point, I looked up and realized my friends had dispersed. That's when I met Jasmine. As I was quietly standing amidst the throng of partiers, I was bumped by some drunk directly on my elbow. This caused me to spill my nearly full nursed beer on the petite beauty, who happened to be walking by at that moment. "Thanks a lot." She looked at me frowning. The beer had spilled on her bare shoulder and down the front of her tank top. "I am so sorry," I said to her as I grabbed a napkin out of my back pocket. I wiped some of the liquid from her bare shoulder and then moved to dab at her shirt. I realized quickly that dabbing at her shirt meant contact with her shapely breasts. Midway to doing so, my hand froze before it touched her feminine mounds. I awkwardly said, "Here," and I handed her the napkin. She grabbed the napkin in my hand, but continued holding my hand. All the time, her initial scowl turned into a half-smile, made all the more sexy by her half-lidded stare as she watched my fumbling reaction. "You're not going to finish the job?" she asked me. Well, I just thought." I stuttered and nodded toward her chest. She started laughing. "I'm just teasing you," she said. "Most guys will take any excuse to cop a quick feel." I opened my mouth to say something, but blushingly was at a loss for words. "Well, I guess we should meet formally before we get to second base," she said with a smile on the verge of laughter. "I'm Jasmine Duval," she said, and extended her right hand to shake mine. I was still flustered by her statement about second base. "Hi," was all I mustered out. She stared at me with that same half-lidded smile. She continued to hold my right hand. We stood that way for several seconds. Normally," she said, "when you're introduced, you also let the other person know what your name is too." She cocked her head to look at me, still smiling and still holding my hand. "Yes, sorry," I fumbled out. "I'm Owen Isaacson," I finally said. "Well, nice to meet you, Owen Isaacson," she said as she shook my hand. "Now, why don't you and I find a beer for me to drink, rather than to wear?" she said as she grabbed my arm and steered us both toward the kegs. And with that, I spent the entire party with Jasmine. I learned that she was a sophomore, but that this was her first year at Taft. She was studying business. She didn't live on campus, but in an apartment in a building that her family owned. I told her a little about my rural upbringing. Physically, she was attractive, maybe in a less wholesome way as some of the other girls I dated, but still quite good-looking. Her hair was blonde, or I guess what's called frosted. She was probably a foot shorter than my 6 feet 2 inches, petite, with a tight lean body with a muscular hips. And as I had noticed, facially she had a sexy half-lidded look with a broad, inviting smile. At the end of the evening, she asked if I would walk her home. Her apartment was above a restaurant, a place I'd heard of but never been in. It was called Papaya, and it was right on the corner in the downtown area next to campus. Papaya had a small coffee shop in front, on the street, and in the back was the bar. Kind of a hookup spot with a little bit of a wilder reputation. "My brother owns the building," Jasmine told me. I was impressed. Beyond the coffee shop/bar, there was a Togo pizza place and a mobile phone store on the retail level. Above, on the second level, were offices, including her brother's, and then on the third and fourth floor there were residential apartments. That's where Jasmine lived. "I don't have a roommate right now," she told me as we walked the back stairs to her place. I was curious where this was all going. Suddenly, the brief fumblings in my dorm room seemed at a different level than being alone in an apartment with this attractive girl. I became ever so slightly nervous. We entered her apartment, and even though I hesitated, at her threshold, as if I was going to leave, she, still holding my arm, overcame my minor hesitation and pulled me in. "Here, let's sit on the couch." And she pulled me over to it. I sat on one edge, and she sat in the middle. We were side by side, our faces quite close together. We talked a little, and I knew it was time to make a move or not. Finally, I leaned in and kissed her. She responded enthusiastically, probing deeply with her tongue. I had my arms around her. After several minutes of kissing, she broke away from me. "I'll be right back," she told me. I began thinking that we'd gone far enough on our first, not even a date. I prepared to get ready to leave. It was quickly clear she did not want me to leave yet. She walked back and wearing only the skimpiest of thong underwear, completely topless. "I thought I'd better get my clothes in the wash after you spilled beer all over them," she said with that same sexy smile I'd noticed before. Not that it mattered, but I didn't hear any washing machine running. She wrapped her body around me, and my urge won out over my moral upbringing. Jasmine fumbled at the buckle of my jeans as my hands explored her spectacular body. Finally, she had me undressed. "Wow, they grow them big out on the farm," she exclaimed. My male ego was pleased with her statement. We made our way to her bed, the first time for me, fully nude with a girl in a bed. I guess my pin of energy was overloaded, and before we even had a chance for action, I erupted all over her sheets. "Whoa," Jasmine exclaimed. "You were excited. Next time we will go a little slower," she told me. The next time? Things were looking up. Jasmine got up and went to the bathroom. She came back with a wet washcloth to clean up my mess. I was a little embarrassed that I was done so quickly. I was in totally uncharted waters. But Jasmine didn't seem to mind. She wiped down the bedding and then started wiping down my leg, my stomach. "Okay," she said, "this time we'll do it my way." I silently nodded my agreement. We had sex and finally, my virginity had been taken. Once my physical euphoria subsided, my thoughts swirled. Had I morally sinned? What is my relationship now with this woman who was a stranger mere hours ago? Do I like her? I think so. Does she like me? Or was this just a one-night stand for her? I hoped it wasn't a one-night stand. Finally, what is the appropriate next step? Should I leave? Jasmine snuggled up next to me, the warmth of her nude body soft against my skin. We were silent, but she emitted a soft hum of contentment, almost like the purring of a kitten. I was relaxed and content also, but the confusing thoughts remained. What should I do? Where is this going? And what does she want? Shortly afterwards, she disentangled herself and went to the bathroom. I lay there for a moment and then sat up on the edge of the bed and began to put my underwear on. Just then Jasmine returned. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked, with just a bit of an edge to her tone. "Well, I thought I should probably get going," I mumbled in answer. "Don't you want to stay?" she asked, and walked over, threw her arms around me, and sat on my lap. I was at a loss. Yes, I wanted to stay. I was very attracted to Jasmine. Yes, I also had moral reservations, but those seemed to be diminishing quickly. More than anything, I had no previous experience with this type of social sexual protocol. So I stayed, and we spent the weekend together. And then I started seeing Jasmine regularly. Since I shared an apartment with 3 other guys, we were normally at Jasmine's place. Now that my virginity had been eclipsed, any moral reservations seemed hypocritical to enforce. I couldn't get enough of Jasmine sexually, and she seemed just as enthusiastic. Though sex preoccupied a lot of the time we were together, that wasn't all we did. We went to restaurants, participated in different college activities, studied together, and did many of the normal things that people dating do. Throughout these first few weeks with Jasmine, I discovered something. Beyond the sex, I actually grew to care for her. My roommates noticed my overnight absences, and I had to explain. I told them I had a kind of girlfriend now, and that I was spending a lot of time with her. "Who is it?" Charlie asked one evening when all 4 of us were at our apartment. I explained that her name is Jasmine and that this is her first year at Taft. I told them I had met her at the all-campus party a few weeks ago. "Is she the chick with the bleach blonde hair you were at that party with?" one of my roommates asked. "Wait a second," Charlie interjected. "Is her brother the big dude that owns Papaya?" he asked. I told them I wasn't sure. I hadn't met her brother yet. But it seemed likely since she said her family owned the building where her apartment was, and that was where Papaya was too. We just hadn't discussed this topic yet. Later, after our other roommates had wandered off, Charlie and I had a brief discussion. "Owen," Charlie said to me, "look man, I'm glad you have this new girlfriend. You deserve someone good. But just be careful." He told me. "Careful about what?" I asked him. "Sometimes sex and true feelings can get mixed up, especially with your first real girlfriend." He said. "Just go slow, take it easy, and keep your eyes wide open." I thought about what Charlie said, and even though I appreciated the concern, I wasn't worried about that now. Much later, I wished I'd paid more attention to what Charlie had said that night. I did end up meeting Jasmine's brother at Papaya. "So you're the new dude in my little sis's life," the brother said as he reached out a meaty hand and we shook. I studied her brother. Physically, they were very different in stature. Jasmine was lean and petite, and Claude Francis, that was the brother's name, was big. I could see the facial similarities. I estimated Claude at 6'3", slightly taller than me, but probably 70 or 80 pounds heavier than me. Probably 240. Overweight but solid. He had the same half-lidded eyes as Jasmine and the broad smile. Only difference was when Claude Francis smiled, there was an absence of mirth in his expression. "Sit down," Claude said as he motioned to the booth he was sitting in. "Have a drink. While you have." He had a booming loud voice. "Just ice water." I told him. "Nah, you need a drink." He turned toward the bartender. "Didn't he bring Owen here a beer?" I decided not to protest. The lean guy, blonde hair prematurely balding, behind the bar hustled over with a pint of beer. I also noticed another guy at a back table. He had a stack of papers on the table, maybe receipts. He seemed to be reviewing the information. He was rough-looking, dark-complected, a shaved head, with tattoos creeping up his neck. He kept glancing over toward our booth. Claude Francis told me he owned the building but did not operate the bar and coffee shop. He nodded in the direction of the tattooed guy. "Armin runs the restaurant. I'm just the landlord," Claude said, and the tattooed guy, Armin, stared across the barroom at me and gave me a brief, curt nod. "You got to come by at night when this place is busy. A lot of action. Lots of people, a lot of fun," Claude added. "Perhaps I will," I told Claude, knowing that this was definitely not my type of place whatsoever. Later, when Jasmine and I were alone, she told me that her big brother was kind of wild and had a few run-ins with the law. It sounds like he had inherited the property from their mother's third husband who had died of a heart attack. She also told me that Claude was very protective of her. I thought about that. Even though Claude was not my type of person, I was glad that he took care of Jasmine. Jasmine and my relationship grew stronger. We were together a lot. I realized that we had completely different upbringings and different attitudes about our lives and the world. Deep down, I had strong morals and believed in the disciplined model my parents had set for me. Jasmine was raised with no biological father and several different stepfathers. Her brother ran with a rough crowd in high school, and I got the feeling that Jasmine was on the fringes of that crowd too. I was pretty sure I was getting an edited version of her life, and that she may have omitted several of the more outrageous chapters. Despite our different upbringings, for the most part, we got along quite well. We didn't always agree on things, and when that happened, we'd agree to disagree. I told myself that our differences helped each other to broaden our life horizons. She pushed me to expand my boundaries a bit, and I wanted her to calm down a little and inject a little discipline. There were a few times I saw an angry, aggressive side of Jasmine. For example, the type of anger directed at another driver in a road rage type of outburst. A few times they were focused toward me. This always ended quickly, but I would get a brief look at a side of Jasmine I didn't often see. It bothered me. Weeks turned into months for us, and before we knew it, the semester was up. I spent the summer as an intern with the university AG department. Jasmine stayed in her apartment that summer and worked at Papaya. Normally she worked days in the coffee shop, but occasionally she worked in the bar. We were basically living together. On some of the nights she worked at Papaya, I would stop by, sit at the bar, and wait for her to get off. I would observe the patrons of the bar. They were definitely a rougher crowd. There was a cheapness to the girls and a predatory nature to the men. Often Claude Francis was there at a back table with the tattooed Armin. Claude was always friendly with me, but there was something about him I did not trust. I was never quite comfortable around him. Another thing that bothered me was the way some of the customers seemed overly friendly with Jasmine. An arm around her waist as she was taking an order, a pat on the bum, or too close a hug. All things that in my opinion was way too familiar for a female in a committed relationship. When I would bring this up with Jasmine, she would shrug it off. That's just what happens to a girl working in a bar sometimes. She would say to me, the casualness of her reply about something I held sacred, her physical body, bothered me, and I knew it was something we would eventually need to discuss. Another thing that happened that summer was that I missed the deadline for the university's study abroad program. I have to say that my relationship with Jasmine interfered with my motivation to apply for the programs. Later, when I reflected that sometimes you need to sacrifice your own personal desires when in a relationship, I couldn't quite find satisfaction in that answer. I really did have a strong desire to study abroad, and now as I entered my senior year of college, I had let that opportunity slip away. That thought troubled me. Jasmine's and my relationship was steady and comfortable my senior year. Jasmine seemed to be taking something less than a full load of classes this year, and she never seemed to spend much time on homework. On the other hand, my senior year was an important year for me educationally, and between my work in the research department at the university and my regular classes, I was busy. Jasmine had met my family on a trip we took at the end of the summer to Benton. It was almost like observing two entirely different species. Jasmine was attractive and flamboyant. Her frosted hair, her makeup, her stylish and sometimes sexy clothing compared starkly with my family. My mother wore no makeup, nor did many of the people in our farming community. My family's clothes were far from new and were functional, not stylish. Shapeless drab clothing that served a purpose, not designed to enhance the attractiveness of the wearer. Despite that, my family was warm and polite towards Jasmine. Jasmine, I do believe, truly appreciated some of the simplicity of our lifestyle and even commented about some of the positives of a farm life. She wasn't suggesting we move to Benton and plant corn and wheat, but I do believe she had a little broader understanding of that type of lifestyle after meeting my family. Much later, I reflected that perhaps I was trying to get her to understand there was more to life than some of the superficial things she seemed to value. I was trying to save her, help her temper her more spontaneous lifestyle. On the other hand, she opened me up to a much different view of the world than I had experienced growing up. This broadened my life experiences and showed me a more exciting glimpse of a different world. And talk about exciting, our sex life just kept getting better and better. The sex was great, and much of our time together was spent in her bed in the apartment above Papaya. After my somewhat repressed sexual experiences before I had met Jasmine, I was now making up for lost time. Occasionally, when we would have a disagreement or some small conflict, Jasmine would use sex to patch us back together. This always worked, and whatever problem we encountered became secondary to the making up. The problem, I later reflected, was that we never truly addressed the issues. During winter break, I went home to Benton to spend the holidays with my family. This was always a happy time for us, and we'd get together at my family home with friends and relatives. There were decorations at the house, music was played, and delicious food was served. For us, though, Christmas truly had a spiritual meaning. And as we attended church services, I believe our entire family became more cloaked in the true religious nature of the season. It was during this time my father, somewhat uncharacteristically, asked if I'd take a walk with him. "Owen," he began, a little awkwardly, "are you still spending as much time with your lady friend Jasmine?" he asked. I recall when my dad and I had the birds and the bees talk. A little uncomfortable, and I think we were both relieved when he was done with that discussion. This talk had that same necessary but uncomfortable tone. "Yes," I replied, "Jasmine and I are together." I told him. We walked silently for a bit. It was like my dad was processing this small kernel of information. "Now, son," he said, a touch more seriously, "as a young man I know you have desires and she is a pretty young woman, but intercourse before marriage is a sin." "Dad," I began, trying to slow the course of this discussion. "Owen," he said with his sternest voice, "just hear me out. If you feel strong enough about this young woman to share your most intimate gift, I would expect you would feel strong enough about her to do the right thing and marry her. You're almost done with college, and your adult life is about to start. The way we raised you was to always do your best and do the right thing. Part of my job as your father is to help you look at the world with some of the knowledge I've acquired." He continued. "Son," he said, putting his arm affectionately over my shoulder as we walked, "it's your life. You get to make your own choices, but I just want you to think about the steps that you take. And every time you take that next step, just make sure you're heading in the right direction." And that's all he said. I thought about his words as we trudged along that country road. Why shouldn't I marry Jasmine? She had brought me more joy, happiness, and pleasure than I had ever experienced. Sure, we had our differences, but I told myself those differences would make us stronger together. A few days later, I was loading up to head back to Taft. I gave everyone a hug goodbye, and words of endearment were spoken in parting. All the way back to college, I thought more and more about my conversation with my dad. With these thoughts, I entered winter term at Taft. I had been encouraged to apply for a postgraduate research job at the university. This would be a paid position, and I enjoyed my part-time work I had been doing. I would do the same type of research, I'd just be paid better. One night, Jasmine and I were talking in her apartment. "What do you plan on doing once you graduate?" I asked Jasmine. "I'm really not sure what I'm going to do." She said, "I wouldn't mind moving somewhere warm, California, Florida, someplace like that." I got to thinking, what if she decided to move? My life was here, and if I took the research position, it would stay here. Over the next few weeks, I began to consider what my life would be without Jasmine. I decided that I didn't want that. I wanted her. That thought, coupled with the words my dad shared with me, combined to help me come to the conclusion that I wanted to marry Jasmine. I rationalized that some of the concerns I had about her, we as a married couple, would overcome. I thought about my parents' marriage and how tight a unit they were. That's what I wanted for Jasmine and me. It was a few weeks later. Jasmine and I were having dinner in a small cafe in town. "Jasmine," I began, "you have made me so happy over this past year. You have shared your life, your world, and your body with me. I want to be with you forever." I reached into my pocket and retrieved the ring. Handing her the box, I said, "Jasmine, will you marry me?" She looked at me as if she wasn't sure I was serious. She held the box but had not yet opened it. She stared at me, a puzzled half smile on her face, as if she didn't quite comprehend what I just asked her. "You want to get married to me?" She finally said to me with that still puzzled expression on her face. "Yes," I said to her, staring deep into her eyes. At last she opened the box and put on the ring. She looked at me, and then looked at the ring on her finger, many emotions reflected in her face. "Are you sure?" she asked. I nodded, still staring, awaiting an answer. She took a deep breath, looked at the ring again, and then looked at me. "Sure," she said. "Why not?" she added with a shrug and a smile. On one hand, I was glad she said yes. On the other hand, this is supposed to be a huge emotional life milestone. Jasmine was treating it a bit casually. Oh well, I thought, just another difference between the two of us. Bottom line, she said yes. One of the things on our pre-marriage to-do list was to get our legal affairs conjoined in preparation to becoming husband and wife. There was no prenuptial agreement, but we did make a simple will. We also bought small life insurance policies. If anything happened to me, I wanted to make sure Jasmine and any future children were taken care of. Over the next few months, wedding planning dominated our discussions. I realized partway through winter term Jasmine had dropped out of college. When I asked her about it, she told me she'd re-enroll in the fall. This bothered me, but I kept it to myself. One of the wedding challenges was the differences in our families. I've described my religious, humble, hard-working family. Jasmine's family were quite a bit freer of spirit. Drinking, smoking, perhaps some drug use. These were all common habits amongst the Duvals. Though the wedding ceremony would take place in a local church, the reception would be at Papaya. The dichotomy between the two venues was symbolic of the cultural differences of our two families. I decided to not think too deeply about all this and just enjoy the event. And I did. Surprisingly, there were no major incidents. My family seemed to be in slight awe of the environment at Papaya, but no one criticized or acted judgmental about the social diversity. Midway through the reception, I was talking with my mother. "Jasmine's family is quite colorful," she commented without even the slightest hint of criticism in her voice. I just hugged my mom and said, "They sure are." Later, I had another conversation. This time it was with Claude Francis. My relationship with Jasmine's brother had progressed, I guess, but I was still wary of him. He had this large bullying attitude, all designed to get what he wanted. He had never done anything specifically to me, but bottom line, I did not trust him. But he was her brother. He cared about her and was protective of her, and I was glad of that. "Congratulations, Owen," Claude said to me and wrapped me in a big bear hug, squeezing me almost to the level of pain. "Thank you, Claude," I said. "I love your sister and want to provide a good life for her," I told him with honest sincerity. He stared at me, nodding his head almost like he was assessing my words, judging the truthfulness of my statement. He slung his meaty arm across my back, his hand resting on the nape of my neck. Good, he said. "You know, she never had a real father. I'm the closest thing she has to something like that, and I take that responsibility seriously," he said, the sound of his voice edging away from the previous, more positive tone. "You take good care of her, got that?" He said, a bit of harshness in his voice and a final painful squeeze to my neck as he mingled away. I stood silently for a moment, thinking of Claude Francis's words. That almost sounded like a threat, I thought. At first, married life was not terribly different from our lives before the wedding. We lived in Jasmine's apartment above Papaya. I wanted to save money to buy a house or some land as soon as possible. The cheap rent would help us with that. I kept expecting to feel different or find some type of change in our lives now that we were officially married. But no, things felt pretty much the same, at least for a while. I insisted that Jasmine re-enroll for fall term. She agreed, but there was not much enthusiasm. I tried slowly and carefully to install some disciplines in Jasmine's life. Studying more, drinking less, occasionally attending church, just small things to have a more enriched life. This was all done. At first, good-naturedly, her reply would often be to me, "Yes, Dad," and we'd chuckle about it. Somewhere along the way, late in our first year of marriage things began to change. The good-natured reminders turned to accusations of nagging. The slight philosophical differences weren't broadening both of our horizons. They were creating an ever-so-slight chasm between us. Another thing I was growing to resent was her hanging out at Papaya. She still worked there part-time, often during the day at the coffee shop, but also occasionally in the bar at night. The bar scene was quite free. Anything seemed to go. It certainly could be described as on the edge of moral turpitude. I had described the overly friendly actions of some of the customers, and this continued to bother me. But what bothered me even more was the fact that Jasmine sometimes would hang out at the bar when she wasn't working. This was another point of disagreement between us. Right around the time when some of our marital problems became a little sharper, my job situation began to change. Despite the challenges and problems with Jasmine, work for me was going very well. My job in the research arm of the college was focused on increased agricultural production. Our goal was to get more yield out of the same land. We were developing the idea of hybrid crops, which could rejuvenate the soil with certain genetic differences. We could make small changes each season, so the soil could be revitalized with the hybrid product. The college had some acres of farmland in a trust where these experiments could be tested. As my research progressed, and we were getting positive early reports on some of the results, it became clear that I would need to be on site on a regular basis. The challenge was that the land was over 200 miles away, over a 3-hour drive each way. There was a small farmhouse with working plumbing and electricity, but beyond that there were few frills at the farmhouse. There was also a greenhouse on the property that acted as the lab. I remember first coming home to tell Jasmine about the progress of my research and the next step, actually implementing the theory of increased productivity on actual farmland. This can help monumentally with productivity, I excitedly explained to Jasmine. If we can increase yield by 20%, that could have a major impact on our food supply. I told her. Sounds good, she replied as she studied her phone. Clearly my enthusiasm had not rubbed off on her. Jazz, I said, this is important to me. I want you to share in my life, I told her. At the change in my tone, she looked at me, smiled, and said, Owen, I am happy for you. It's just that sometimes I don't understand all of it. I nodded at her statement. Sure, agricultural research is pretty dry, but I thought spouses were supposed to be interested in what the other was doing. So anyway, I continued. Starting next month, I will be down at the farm in Blackstock for 3 days every other week. So you'll be overnight? She asked. I told her yes, it was way too far to come home every night, but she could come with me if she could arrange her schedule in a particular week. Jasmine didn't reply to this. She just stared off into space, thinking private thoughts. During this time, there were certainly positive moments in our relationship, but there were also other times that were not as positive. I tried to be open to compromising on certain things where we disagreed, but the fun-loving freedom of the time during our engagement and the early part of marriage was becoming hard to recapture. My first trip to the college farm in Blackstock was a positive experience. I worked probably 12 hours each day. I was excited about the research and nearly oblivious to my surroundings. I did not notice the near primitive living conditions or the absence of normal comforts such as a television. I was immersed in my work. When I returned Friday afternoon, I was excited to tell Jasmine all about my trip. I found her in the bar at Papaya talking to one of the bartenders, Dennis Libby. It was early and the evening's craziness hadn't yet begun. Dennis was one of the few decent people that worked at Papaya. I learned he worked at the bar, but was also a student, partway to getting his bachelor's degree. Not like that creep, the owner, Armin, I thought. I noticed that Claude Francis wasn't there, and for some reason I was relieved to know that. I sat with Jasmine and Dennis brought me a beer. I talked with great enthusiasm of my trip to Blackstock and the progress I had made. Dennis seemed interested and pleasantly asked me about my research. I begged Jasmine to go with me in 2 weeks. She reluctantly agreed. I really thought it was important that our lives were coming led. Our trip together to Blackstock was a disaster, and it was mostly my fault. I made the mistake of projecting my interest in my research as something that Jasmine would be interested in. She wasn't. Though it hadn't registered with me, the small farmhouse was kind of a dump. It was situated in the midst of corn and soybean fields. Furthermore, there was not even a working television. Jasmine became bored quickly. She kept pestering me while I tried to work. On our second day there, I snapped at her to allow me to work. This pissed her off. Much later, I reflected that I should have known she wouldn't enjoy this experience. Driving back on Friday, I tried to apologize. Jasmine, I began. I am so sorry that I yelled at you. That wasn't fair of me. I guess if you're not working on something, like I was, it would be kind of boring. She sat silently in the seat next to me, arms crossed, a negative look on her face, gazing out the window. Finally, she replied, Kind of boring, she said. At least she said something. Jazz, honey, I said, please forgive me. I think one of the things that always attracted me to you is that you are different from me. We have different interests. You have shown me a side of life that I may have never known without you. I continued. I accept that we are different and have different ideas about life. I think this will make us stronger together. Do you really mean that? She asked. I was overjoyed that her bad mood was lifting. Of course I do, Jasmine, I said. More than anything, I want you to be happy. Little did I know then what her interpretation of my last statement would mean. Over the next week or so before I went back to Blackstock, we got along great, like early marriage great. We made love frequently, we didn't argue. Jasmine seemed more upbeat than she had in a long time. The morning I left for Blackstock, she gave me an enthusiastic BJ as a farewell. I felt like our relationship was back moving in the right direction. I decided I would try to stay more connected with her while I was gone and not get overly absorbed in my work. The problem was she didn't answer my phone calls. I called her twice Wednesday night, Thursday morning, and Thursday evening. I finally reached her mid-morning on that Friday. Hello, she croaked into the phone. It was clear I had woken her. Jasmine? I exclaimed. Are you still sleeping? I asked. No, I'm getting up. She mumbled into the phone. Jasmine, you have morning classes, I said. What are you doing still in bed? I asked. I guess I don't feel too great. She told me. I didn't accuse her of it, but she sounded more hungover than anything else. I was angry with her. She wasn't taking her studies seriously. I kept quiet and disengaged, telling her I'd see her when I got home that night. That night was a little tense, not the carefree mood we had experienced before I left. I was mad and she acted odd, almost guilty about something. Try as I might, I couldn't get either of our moods aligned correctly. One night I even suggested we go to Papaya for a drink and an early dinner, knowing that she enjoyed that scene. Jasmine surprisingly was not in favor of this. She seemed to love the atmosphere at Papaya. I wondered why she was opposed to this. Fairly soon I was back at the farm in Blackstock. This time when I called Jasmine she did answer, but she never wanted to talk very long. She was pleasant when I returned on Friday, but something was off. I couldn't quite figure out what was wrong. I believed she was happy with our marriage, but we were just off track. Over the next week and a half I tried hard to get our relationship back going in the right direction. I was overly solicitous. I overlooked some of her lack of discipline on certain things, like her schoolwork. I brought her flowers and other small gifts. I was trying hard to make my marriage work. And though there were glimpses of the positive, loving married relationship we once had, it did not sustain. Driving home one night a few days before I was to head back to Blackstock, I suddenly had this thought. Jasmine seemed bored with our marriage. I had to think about that. Over my 3 days at Blackstock, I thought of what I could do to get her more engaged. And then I thought of our honeymoon in Cancun. I remembered the carefree days of sunshine, beaches, swimming pools, and great sex. Lots of great sex. This was just the thing I thought. This could jumpstart the marriage and get us back on track. Friday morning I got up early and got all my work done at the farm. I left just after 1 p.m. I was excited to surprise Jasmine with the news about our trip. It would be like a second honeymoon. I very rarely spent money on anything, and certainly not on something like this. She will be very surprised. When I arrived at home, I took my bag up to the apartment. Jasmine wasn't there. I knew Friday her classes were in the morning. Maybe she was working at Papaya. So I walked down to the bar. I stood in the doorway between the coffee shop and the bar looking for Jasmine. I didn't see her, but then I heard her. I knew her laugh. On the far side of the bar I saw her. And what I saw I didn't like. She was sitting on the lap of some dude, arms around his neck. I walked up until I was right behind her. She was turned away from me, but the tattooed dude was facing me. Help you? The dude said to me. I didn't say a word. I just stood there. All of a sudden Jasmine turns her neck to see who the guy was talking to. She had a half smile on her face as she turned. That smile quickly evaporated. Jasmine abruptly stood and disengaged from the lap she had been sitting in. Owen, she said with great alarm. I thought you wouldn't be home until later, she stuttered. Obviously, I said and turned to exit. Owen, wait please, she said. This is just my friend Jerome. We're old friends. She told me. I continued walking. Jasmine caught up and grabbed my arm to stop me. I yanked it back away from her. My pent-up anger likely made me react strongly, and Jasmine stumbled. Just then her brother, Claude, appeared. His two meaty hands grabbed my lean upper arms. What the hell is going on? He asks me, his face tilted sideways, angry and confrontational. None of your business, I say to Claude, and move to disengage from him, but his grip was too much. It looked like you just knocked my sister down, he hissed at me. That makes it my business. Claude, Jasmine said. It's okay. It's just a misunderstanding. Owen didn't mean to. I just slipped. She told him. He held my arms for another moment and then released me. All of a sudden, a small smile appeared on his face. He reached up and brushed imaginary dust off my shoulders and then gave me an aggressive pat on the back. Okay, he said. My bad. I just want to make sure my little sis is okay, he said. And when he said that, he looked back at me, the smile absent for that beat, his eyes giving me a quick hard look. Owen, come on, Jasmine said. Let's go upstairs. Reluctantly, I went, but as we climbed the stairs, my mind swirled with images. Jasmine's laugh, her arms around the guy, the comfort she had sitting on his lap, and finally the interaction with Claude Francis. The only way I could interpret his message to me was as a threat. Our discussion of the incident was pointless. She just maintained her innocence while I had a completely different understanding about how a married woman should act. Over the next several weeks, our relationship was on eggshells. For the first time, I began thinking that perhaps the marriage was a mistake. Where originally I thought our differences would make us stronger, I began to question that hypothesis. On the other hand, Jasmine seemed to work harder at the marriage. She was more affectionate, both sexually and otherwise. She acted more interested in what I was doing, my work, my family, etc. Before these subjects seemed to bore her. I knew that her interest may not truly be genuine, but I also appreciated the effort. It was clear that Jasmine valued the marriage and did not want it to end. This was a start, I thought. One thing that did bother me was that all of a sudden this Jerome character seemed to be around the bar a lot more. I have already said that our apartment was in the same building as the bar, just a few flights up. To get to the apartment stair entrance, you walk down an alley between Papaya and the building next door. This alley was the designated smoking area. Smoking was banned inside the bar. Occasionally, I would see this guy Jerome out in the alley smoking these long, thin, black, cigar-like things. Not a cigarette, but definitely not a big, thick cigar. I didn't know enough about tobacco products to know what they were called. When I'd see him, neither of us would ever speak. But he'd give me a funny little smile as I walked by, almost taunting. One time I saw him with a small group, all smoking, Jerome with the skinny cigar thing. Once again, he gives me the smirking look and I ignore it. But once I had passed the group, I heard them all laugh in unison, as if the butt of some joke had just been told. As much as I loved my lab work on the farm, I began to dread the trips. My trust for Jasmine had certainly slipped, and many negative images would cloud my imagination while I was gone. When I'd arrive home on Friday evenings, I was always slightly nervous about how I may find Jasmine. So far, though, other than the incident with Jerome, I had no reason to doubt Jasmine. But my suspicion continued. This particular Friday, I arrived home and saw that Jasmine was working at Papaya. All seemed under control. I trudged up the steps to the apartment. Upon entering, I noticed it was cold inside. I saw 2 windows open and the outside air cooled the rooms. Thinking nothing of it, I closed them. I sat for a moment thinking. This travel was having an effect on my marriage. I began contemplating talking to my supervisor about changing my schedule. I was dwelling too much on what may be happening while I was gone. I needed to stop thinking such negative thoughts. As I unpacked, I decided I would stow my travel bag under the bed. My thought was that the bag was a reminder of my travels, and I wanted to minimize these thoughts. Under the bed would be out of sight and hence, out of mind. I bent down and in the dim light pushed my bag beneath the bed. I noticed something was disturbed on the other side of the bed. I walked around and saw a small dark cylinder. Rodent droppings, I wondered at first, but as I looked closer, suddenly, I realized what I was seeing, and that explained the open window. It was the stub of a thin black cigar or cigarette, and the only one I'd ever seen smoking these was Jerome. I pulled my bag out, turned my iPhone flashlight on, and inspected. As I examined the area underneath the bed, other than some dust, it was empty. But the stub was telltale. I sat for some time thinking. It was more than likely that Jerome had been in our apartment while I was gone, and it was more than likely he'd been somewhere near our bed. And it didn't take great imagination to speculate what that likely meant. I continued to think about the situation. In the community I was raised in, you rarely heard of this type of thing happening much. People didn't seem to sneak around. There was an honesty that you could rely on in the environment I grew up in. I wanted to believe that Jasmine was faithful, but I wasn't stupid. I needed to know for sure. Through my sadness, I began to develop a plan. Jasmine texted me and told me she would be done with her shift at 8 o'clock, and we decided we'd walk down the street for pizza when she was done. I had to act as if nothing was wrong. At Marnella's, we sat and discussed our day together. I gave no hint that I had any suspicions of her dishonesty. We reviewed what we had been doing and the events of our past 2 days apart. I was telling her about some of the far from interesting events at the agricultural lab at the farm. I noticed her drift into a state of relaxed boredom. Out of the blue, I asked her, "Hey, Jazz," I began in a calm offhand voice. "Why were the windows open in the apartment?" I asked. Immediately, she tensed up. Her relaxed posture had changed. She looked at me, eyes wide, mouth open, no words coming out. I innocently looked back at her. No anger or incrimination in my expression. She began. "I guess I was hot and I wanted to cool off," she said, and her inflection even started to tail off nearly like a question, as if she was asking if I believed her or not. Still playing the role, I continued my innocent expression. "Oh, okay," I said as if in agreement with her logic. After I said this, I saw her noticeably relax. She even exhaled what nearly sounded like a phew when she thought I had accepted her explanation of the windows. But her guilt had flashed plainly during the short topic of the open windows, and while we sat discussing the events of our days, another part of my brain was working on the next step in my plan. On Monday in my office at the university, I did something I could never have imagined I would have to do in my life. I called a private investigator. It was actually a little embarrassing to explain the situation. I finally found someone that could see me fairly quickly, and we made an appointment for Tuesday afternoon at a coffee shop on the other side of town. His name was Paul Gamble. He was far from any type of glamorous PI from a television show. He looked like a kindly older uncle, weathered face lined with wrinkles, gray crew cut, sad downturned eyes, and slightly overweight. He told me he'd retired from the Wichita police force 4 years ago and started his small investigation business. I explained to him the circumstances of my suspicions. "So you think that anything that may be happening happens when you were at this farm?" he asked as he took a sip of coffee. He had a small spiral notebook and made occasional notes. I nodded. "Can we get into the apartment sometime when your wife isn't around?" he asked. I told him, yes, and I would find out what her schedule was and make plans based on that. He told me, based on the facts I'd given him, that the most efficient and least expensive way to handle the investigation was to place wireless cameras in the apartment. If that didn't work, he could try other avenues, including following her. "That can get expensive," he told me. "Let's start with the electronics and see what happens." After finding out Jasmine's schedule, we determined Thursday afternoon would be the best time for Paul and I to have private access to the apartment. I told him I would meet him there at 3 p.m. Paul had these tiny wireless cameras. I was concerned that Jasmine may notice them, but they really were quite small. The apartment wasn't that big, so we only needed to place 3 of them: the main room, the bathroom, and of course the bedroom. "I've got the base unit at my office," he told me. "The cameras are dormant unless there is movement, and then they begin recording. They have fair battery life, but I'm not going to activate them until next Wednesday when you head back to the farm," he added. I nodded. After Paul left, I first became nervous and then sad. I remembered how positive I was that marriage to Jasmine would be the right thing. I recalled my dad telling me, in so many words, that if I felt strong enough about her to sleep with her, then I should feel strong enough to marry her. And at that moment, that made perfect logical sense. And if the woman that I was with was one of the girls I grew up with in Benton, his logic would have applied. But Jasmine wasn't like those girls. At first, I liked that she was so different. It gave her an exotic contrast from the more plain girls from Benton. But, as I was learning, there just may be a steep price to pay for that exotic difference. Tears dried, face washed. I assumed my easygoing, trusting demeanor. I was going to have to put on a good act over the next week. I must have pulled it off because there were no significant reactions to my behavior, and all seemed normal. I did notice Jerome once leaving Papaya as I was coming home. He didn't see me. Driving to the farm that Wednesday morning, I was full of anxiety. I literally prayed that Paul would find nothing from his spy cameras and our marriage would go on. I began having thoughts of Jasmine and I moving, buying a house, and raising a family. And then I would flash to that dark, thin cigar but under my bed, and there was really only one logical explanation for that. These were the thoughts that swirled through my brain over the next 3 days. I kept my phone conversations with Jasmine brief. Nearly hourly, I had the urge to call Paul and get a report on what he had recorded. Finally, Friday morning, I nervously called him. I got voicemail. An hour or so later, I got a text from Paul. "Out of town until Sunday. Let's meet up Monday whenever you are available." I read the message with a mixture of feelings. Primarily, I wanted to find out the truth, but I also had temporary relief that I would not know anything potentially bad for a few extra days. My anxiety increased. That weekend, I must have been behaving strangely. I was nervous, unfocused, and not nearly as affectionate as I normally was after being separated from Jasmine for a few days. "Are you okay?" She asked. I nodded yes, everything was fine, but I could feel the falseness of the positive expression. I assumed she most likely saw it too. Finally, after an uncomfortable weekend, I met with Paul at the same small coffee shop. I tried to judge what the results may be of the investigation by his expression, but his face was blank. I sat across from him. He had a tan file folder in front. We made eye contact for a minute, and then with a deep sigh, he pushed the folder across to me. Owen, he began. It's not good. I've got more pictures and some video if you want, and you may need it later, but this, and he nodded toward the folder, will tell you all you need to know. At first, I just stared at that folder, afraid to open it. Finally, I couldn't shake the trembling of my hands as I opened the file. There were 6 photos. Jasmine embracing Jerome in our living room. Jasmine topless with Jerome's mouth on her breast. Jerome and Jasmine naked on our bed. Jasmine on top of Jerome. And finally, Jerome taking her from behind, hands firmly on her hips. I sat there, oblivious to Paul's presence, with graphic confirmation of my wife's adultery. And though tears welled up in my eyes, a new emotion was emerging. I was becoming angry. I wanted to kill Jerome and somehow punish Jasmine too. Paul must have observed this transformation in me. He reached across the table and clapped my arm. Listen, son, he began. I know you're upset. Anyone would be, but don't do anything stupid. In my years on the force, I've seen plenty of people ruin their lives over things like this. You need to think about your next steps carefully, he added. And little by little what Paul said to me started to make sense. I needed to develop a plan. As much as I wanted physical retribution, I didn't want to ruin my life. I sat there feeling all the love I ever had for Jasmine turning to stone. Not sure what you're planning on, Paul quietly said. But if you're thinking you need a lawyer, I've got a recommendation for you. Also, if you decide to go down the road to divorce, I have something else for you. I hesitate to call it good news, but in this state, adultery is grounds for divorce. It might make it easy if you decide to go that route. I sat and thought about what Paul had just said. In my mind, there was no doubt. I couldn't stay married to Jasmine. Even if I did forgive her for Jerome, I doubted I could ever trust her. No, divorce was my only option. I thanked Paul, paid him, and then asked for the name of the lawyer. I continued to sit in the coffee shop with the incriminating photos tucked under the file folder page. I knew I had to get away from Jasmine. I didn't trust myself around her. I thought of heading back to Benton, but I quickly dismissed that idea. That felt too much like a public admission of failure. And then it hit me. The timing may just be about right, I thought. I quickly headed over to the AG department at Taft University. Taft had an exchange research program with a number of universities around the world. The idea was that a visiting research assistant or professor would spend time at other colleges' agricultural departments doing research and exchanging ideas. Normally, there was a minimum time commitment required. I had seen these notices frequently at Taft. I remember being interested in this as an undergraduate. After I arrived at the university, I searched out and found my supervisor, Tim Kerwin. I explained that I was interested in an overseas research position as soon as possible. Tim removed his glasses, cocked his head, and stared at me. These are normally pretty primitive posts, Owen, he said to me. I nodded, yes, I knew that. Aren't you still kind of a newlywed? He asked. He had attended our wedding. I shook my head from side to side and told him that that wouldn't matter. Look, Owen, there are many places that would love to have you, he began. It's just that I've seen married people try to do these exchanges, and it normally doesn't work out too well. I have a responsibility to you, and also our exchange partners. To be honest, I wouldn't recommend it, he told me. I took a deep breath. Finally, without telling all the details, I explained that my marriage would be ending shortly. I wanted to leave the area just as soon as I could. The further away and the longer the commitment, the better, I told Tim. He looked across the desk at me, absorbing what I had told him. I wouldn't advise it, he said. Tim, one way or another, I began. I'm getting out of here. I like Taft and I want to continue my affiliation with the university, but for now, I can't stay in this town.